The engine is still humming, your hands are tight on the wheel, and in that quiet space before the officer reaches your window, most drivers make a decision they don't even realize they're making, and it can cost them far more than a ticket. Let me ask you something honestly. If you got pulled over right now, would you start explaining yourself immediately, or would you stay silent and let the moment play out? Drop your answer in the comments, because what you think is the polite thing to do in that situation is often exactly what gets people into trouble. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why that split-second instinct can quietly turn into a legal trap. Now, here's where most people get this completely wrong. We grow up believing that cooperation means talking, that if you just explain yourself clearly enough, if you're respectful enough, honest enough, calm enough, everything will work out. That mindset works in everyday life. It does not always work during a traffic stop, because a traffic stop is not just a conversation. It is a structured legal interaction where every word you say can be used, interpreted, or even misunderstood in ways you never intended. And the biggest mistake I see, over and over again, is people trying to talk their way out of a situation that was never about talking in the first place. Let's slow this down and walk through it carefully, because this is where things start to get interesting. When you're pulled over, your body reacts instantly. Your heart rate increases, your breathing changes, your mind starts racing. You replay what just happened. You start guessing why you were stopped. And then the officer approaches. Now here's the key detail most people miss. By the time the officer reaches your window, they have already started forming an opinion, not a final judgment, but an initial assessment. And that assessment is based on things you didn't even realize mattered. How quickly you pulled over, whether you drifted or stopped smoothly, if you made sudden movements, if you leaned over toward the passenger seat, if your brake lights flickered, if your head kept turning. These are not random observations. They are behavioral cues, and they shape the tone of everything that comes next. Now, let's talk about the moment the window comes down. Most drivers immediately start talking. "Sorry, officer, I didn't realize. I was just trying to... I wasn't speeding, I swear." It feels natural. It feels respectful. It feels like the right thing to do. But here's the problem. You're speaking before you even know what the situation actually is. You're offering information before you've been asked for it. And sometimes, without realizing it, you're admitting things that create legal consequences. Now, let me be very clear about something. Silence does not mean being rude. Silence does not mean being confrontational. Silence, when used correctly, means you are not volunteering unnecessary information. There's a difference, a big one. You still provide your license, registration, and proof of insurance when asked. That's required. But beyond that, you are not obligated to explain your entire life story. And yet, people do it every day. Now, let's bring in the second part of this situation, the engine. This is where things get even more misunderstood. You've probably heard different advice. Some people say turn the engine off immediately to show compliance. Others say keep it running. So, what's the reality? The reality is not as simple as either extreme. Turning off your engine can signal compliance, yes. But it can also place you in a position where restarting the vehicle later becomes part of the interaction, especially if the officer begins to escalate or extend the stop. Keeping your engine running, on the other hand, is not illegal in itself, but it can sometimes be interpreted as uncertainty or readiness to leave, depending on your behavior. And this is where the trap begins. It's not about the engine alone. It's about the combination of your behavior, your words, and how the officer interprets both. Now imagine this scenario. You're pulled over. You turn off the engine immediately. You start talking right away, explaining where you're going, what you were doing, why you might have been going a little fast. The officer listens, and then asks a simple question. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Seems harmless, but think about what happens next. If you guess wrong, you look uncertain. If you admit something, you've just provided evidence. If you ramble, you create inconsistencies. That one question alone has created multiple paths, most of which don't work in your favor. Now, let's rewind that exact same situation, but this time, you handle it differently. You pull over calmly, you keep your hands visible. You don't make sudden movements, you wait. The officer approaches. You provide your documents when asked, and when the question comes, "Do you know why I stopped you?" you respond carefully, not with a long explanation, not with a guess, but with something simple and controlled. Officer, I'd prefer not to answer any questions. Notice the tone, respectful, calm, clear. Now, this is where people get nervous. They think saying something like that will escalate the situation. But in reality, what it does is remove the risk of self-incrimination. Because once you start explaining, you're stepping into a space where your own words can be used against you. And most people don't realize how quickly that can happen. Now let's talk about what the officer is doing during all of this. Because while you're thinking about what to say, they're thinking about something entirely different. They're observing your tone, your breathing, your eye movement, your consistency. They're listening not just to your words, but to how you say them. They're comparing your behavior to patterns they've seen hundreds of times before. And here's something important. Experienced officers are not just reacting, they're predicting. They're trying to determine whether this is a routine stop or something more. And your behavior in those first moments plays a huge role in that decision. Now, let's introduce a situation that happens more often than people realize. The officer goes back to their car, and they stay there longer than expected. This is the moment where most drivers start overthinking everything. Why are they taking so long? Are they running my name? Did I do something wrong? But here's what's really happening. They're checking your license, looking for warrants, reviewing vehicle information, possibly running your name through multiple systems. And they're also thinking, evaluating, deciding what comes next. Now, imagine you had been talking nonstop before this, offering details, explaining things, filling the silence. All of that is now part of the officer's mental picture. But if you stayed calm, provided only what was required, and avoided unnecessary conversation, that picture looks very different, cleaner, simpler, less complicated. Now, let's take this one step further. The officer returns and asks another question. Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? This is where everything we've talked about comes together. Because at this point, your earlier behavior has already set the tone. If you've been nervous, overly talkative, inconsistent, that question carries more weight. If you've been calm, clear, and controlled, the dynamic is different. And this is where you need to be very careful. Because saying yes, even casually, opens the door completely. And once that door is open, it's very difficult to close. Now, here's the part most people don't realize. You can refuse, calmly, respectfully. I do not consent to any searches. No argument, no explanation, no attitude, just clarity. And that single sentence can protect you in ways most drivers never fully understand. Now, this does not guarantee the officer won't search. If they believe they have legal justification, they may proceed anyway. But here's the key difference. If you consent, you've removed your ability to challenge that search later. If you do not consent, you preserve that ability. And that can make a massive difference down the line. Now, let me bring your attention back to something we touched on earlier, the engine, because here's the subtle truth. The engine itself is not the real issue. The real issue is control of the situation, control of your behavior, control of your words. When you combine unnecessary talking with uncertain behavior, you lose control of how the interaction is perceived. And once that perception shifts, it's very hard to bring it back. But when you stay calm, speak only when necessary, and avoid volunteering information, you maintain control, not over the officer, but over yourself. And that's what matters, because at the end of the day, most traffic stops don't escalate because of what the officer does. They escalate because of how the driver reacts. That's the part nobody tells you. That's the part people learn the hard way. So, the next time you find yourself in that moment, engine humming, lights behind you, questions coming your way, remember this. You don't have to fill the silence. You don't have to explain everything. And sometimes, saying less is exactly what keeps a simple situation from turning into something much more serious. Think about that before your next drive.